The first time Carter heard the growl, he told himself it was the wind. The second time, he knew better. It came from deep within Dagger Hollow, rolling through the trees like thunder, shaking the brittle leaves that clung to the branches. He tightened his grip on the rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath a pale mist in the cold West Virginia air. "Probably just a bear," he muttered. Beside him, Eli shook his head. "That ain't no damn bear." The two of them had come up the old mining trail looking for Eli's missing coonhounds. They had torn off their leashes the night before, howling like the devil himself had walked out of the woods. Carter didn't believe in cryptid nonsense. Bigfoot, Mothman, the Flatwoods Monster. He'd heard all the old stories growing up, but he figured they were just the kind of things folks told kids to keep them from wandering too deep into the hollers. But the look on Eli's face told him this wasn't just superstition. "You ever hear of the white thing?" Eli asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter sighed. "You mean that Sheepsquatch nonsense?" Eli didn't laugh. "It ain't nonsense, Carter. Not if you're from these parts." The wind stirred again, rustling the trees. The growl came again, low, guttural, and close. Too close. Eli swallowed hard. That thing don't just watch you, it hunts you. Something moved in the underbrush ahead, branches snapping like gunshots. Carter lifted his rifle, peering through the dim light of the overcast sky. A flash of white. Something huge, covered in matted fur, hunched behind a fallen tree. It wasn't a bear. It was too big, too wrong. Then the smell hit them. Rot, wet fur, blood. Something old and decayed. Eli stepped back, gripping the knife at his belt. "We need to go." Carter wasn't listening. He was staring at the creature's claws, long curved, the kind meant for ripping flesh from bone. The thing stood up, and it was massive. Its fur was as white as frostbitten bone, tangled with brambles and streaked with something dark. Yellowed horns curled from its skull like those of a mountain goat, and its face, good grief, its face, was almost human, stretched and distorted, its eyes black and hungry. Then it screamed. A sound like a bear's roar mixed with a guttural, rage-filled snarl vibrating through the trees. Carter's blood turned to ice. The thing charged. "Run!" Eli shouted, already bolting down the trail. Carter barely had time to react before the beast crashed through the undergrowth like a freight train, tearing through the brush as if it were paper. He fired a shot, the rifle bucking against his shoulder, but it didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. They ran. The trees blurred past them, branches whipping at their faces, boots crunching against the frozen ground. The creature was close, so close Carter could hear the ragged, wet breaths behind him. Eli tripped. Carter skidded to a stop, turning just in time to see the thing lunge. Eli barely managed to roll away, scrambling up just as the beast's claws ripped through the dirt where he had just been. Carter fired again. Bang. But the thing barely flinched. Then something happened that made Carter's stomach drop. The creature grinned. It wasn't an animal's snarl. It wasn't instinct. It was a knowing, deliberate grin, jagged teeth gleaming, dark lips curling. It wanted them to run. Carter grabbed Eli and yanked him up. They sprinted down the trail, lungs burning, the beast's footsteps thundering behind them. Then, a river. The old creek that ran through the valley, swollen from the recent rains. Eli gasped. "It won't cross water." Carter didn't question it. They jumped. The ice-cold water hit them like a sledgehammer, but they didn't stop. They pushed through the current, boots slipping against the rocks. And then, silence. Carter looked back. The creature stood at the edge of the river, nostrils flaring, teeth bared in frustration. It let out another growl, low and furious. Then, without another sound, it turned and melted into the woods. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck. Eli slammed the door shut, his hands shaking. "I told you, man, that thing ain't no bear." Carter couldn't argue, because he knew, deep in his bones, what he had just seen. And next time they might not make it out alive. The first sign was the smell. It was a heavy, cloying stench, something like wet fur and rotting meat, thick as fog in the cold air. Henry stopped on the narrow trail, his breath a pale ghost in the crisp autumn night. The towering pines around him swayed, whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. He had been hiking this stretch of the Olympic National Forest for years, guiding tourists through the ancient mist-drenched trees. But tonight was different. Tonight he was alone, and something was watching him. Behind him, the campfire he'd left burning was now a distant orange glow swallowed by the trees. Ahead, the trail wound deeper into the wilderness, where no one went after dark, not even the most seasoned hunters, because they knew. A branch snapped in the distance, sharp and deliberate. Henry tightened his grip on the hunting knife at his belt. "Just a bear," he muttered. But bears didn't stand still and listen, and whatever this was, it was listening. He took another step, another. The forest swallowed his footfalls, the thick pine needles muffling every sound. Then he heard it, a low guttural growl. Not a bear, not a cougar, something deeper, older. The smell intensified and Henry's pulse kicked into a sprint. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing but shadows and the slow, deliberate sway of the branches. Then movement. A figure just at the edge of sight. Tall, towering. His mouth went dry. He had heard the stories, the whispered warnings passed around the campfire by old-timers who drank too much and spoke too little. The missing hunters, the shredded tents, the eerie, echoing howls in the dead of night. But he hadn't believed, until now. A massive hand covered in thick matted fur gripped the trunk of a tree ahead of him. Fingernails, too long, too human, scratched the bark. Henry took a step back. The thing moved forward, 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its eyes, small and deep-set, reflected the moonlight like burning coals. Henry's breath hitched. It wasn't just watching him. It was deciding. And then the thing spoke, not in words, not exactly, but a guttural, rattling mimicry of human sound. It was wrong, warped, like a voice heard through a broken radio. Go. A word. A command. A warning. Henry stumbled backward, his heart a hammer against his ribs. His knife felt useless. His legs screamed to run. Then the thing charged. A blur of fur and muscle, it moved with an impossible speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. Henry bolted, tearing through the forest, branches slashing at his face, the wet ground sucking at his boots. Behind him, the creature's heavy footsteps pounded like a second heartbeat, closing in. The fire, the only thing between him and whatever fate awaited in the darkness. He crashed into the campsite, breath ragged, hands shaking. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters on the trees. For a moment, silence. Then, a sound that froze him in place. A laugh, low, rasping, not quite human. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. The forest fell still as if it had never been disturbed. But Henry knew better. He knew it was still out there, watching, waiting, and that it had let him live. This time. The first thing Matt noticed was how quiet the road had gotten. He let off the gas, coasting down the narrow, winding back road that cut through the deep woods of Boone County. The old logging road had no name, at least none that appeared on a map, but locals called it Widow's Bend, a place people avoided after dark. Matt had never been one for ghost stories. He was just trying to get home faster, cutting through the hills instead of taking the long way around. But now he wished he hadn't. His radio had cut out a few miles back. His cell service was gone. And worst of all, the crickets had stopped chirping. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but dark, empty road behind him. The trees on either side felt too close, their tangled branches blotting out most of the moonlight. Then, movement. A shape, low and fast, darting through the trees to his right. Matt's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Probably just a deer. Then another shape, on the left this time, running alongside his truck. His pulse quickened. That wasn't normal. Deer didn't run like that. Then he saw the eyes, two glowing red orbs keeping pace with him in the trees. Then a second pair, a third. Matt's breath caught in his throat. They weren't deer. They were dogs. Huge black spectral dogs with burning eyes sprinting just beyond the tree line. A low guttural growl rumbled through the night, so deep it vibrated in Matt's chest. He stomped the gas. The truck's tires kicked up gravel, fishtailing slightly as he sped up. But the dogs kept pace. One of them, a monstrous shadowy thing with jagged fur, leapt onto the road ahead of him. Matt barely had time to react. He swerved hard, barely missing the creature. The truck's tires screamed as he overcorrected, nearly slamming into a tree before straightening out. His heart hammered as he glanced in the mirror. The dog was still there, standing in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. And it was grinning. Then, the howls began. Not normal howls, not like wolves or coyotes. These howls were wrong, deep, hollow, almost human. Matt's blood turned ice cold. He pushed the truck as fast as it would go, the trees flying past in a blur. The road twisted and turned, but the howls never faded. They grew closer. Then the scratching started. Long, sharp claws scraped against the truck bed. Matt's stomach dropped. One of them had jumped on the truck. A massive thud shook the roof. Matt slammed the brakes. The force sent him lurching forward, the seatbelt digging into his chest. The truck screeched to a stop, tires skidding on the loose gravel. Silence. He barely breathed. Then, a heavy breath right above him. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle, but before he could move, the roof buckled. The thing was pressing down, its claws raking across the metal. Matt did the only thing he could think of. He floored it. The truck lurched forward, the sudden acceleration throwing the creature off the roof. In the mirror, he saw it land on all fours, completely unfazed. Then the others stepped onto the road. 5, 6, 7 of them, lined up, watching, waiting. Matt's stomach twisted. The stories were true. The devil dogs weren't just legends. They were real. And worse, they had let him go. For now. The fog was thick on the Tigard River that night. Thicker than it should have been. It clung to the water like something alive, curling around the trees along the shore, swallowing the old railroad bridge in a pale, shifting haze. Caleb adjusted his grip on the oar, his knuckles white. The boat rocked gently beneath him, the only sound the rhythmic drip-drip of water from his paddle. Beside him, Mason flicked on his flashlight, sweeping it over the misty surface. "Don't like this," Mason muttered. Caleb snorted. "You afraid of a little fog?" Mason didn't answer. He was staring toward the shoreline, where the beam of his flashlight caught something wrong. The trees, massive sycamores standing like silent sentinels, looked blurred, distorted, as if something heavy was shifting between them, just out of sight. Then they heard it, a wet, heavy breath. Caleb froze, every instinct screaming. "You hear that?" Mason swallowed hard. "Yeah." Another breath, louder, closer. Then, a splash. Not a small one, not a fish breaking the surface. Something big. The boat rocked violently, sending ripples across the glassy water. Mason swung his flashlight wildly. The fog made it useless. It only illuminated the eerie mist swirling around them. "Let's get the heck out of here," Mason whispered. Caleb nodded, digging his paddle into the water. Then something moved. Not in the trees, not on the shore, in the river. The fog parted just enough for them to see it. A massive, hulking form, smooth and pale, rising from the water like some prehistoric thing. It had no head, or at least none they could see, just a sloping mass of muscle that curved down into enormous, powerful shoulders. Its skin was almost seal-like, but too thick, too unnatural. Then it turned toward them. It had felt them. The air went dead. No wind. No crickets. No frogs. Only the sound of water dripping from its massive body. Then it moved. With a deep guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and the rumble of shifting earth, the thing lunged toward their boat. "What the heck was that?" Mason screamed. Caleb didn't think. He just paddled. The boat lurched, the water churning violently as the monster closed the distance in seconds. A massive hand, if you could call it that, rose from the river, fingers thick as branches, reaching. The boat nearly capsized as the thing's weight sent waves crashing against them. Mason fired. The gunshot cracked through the night, deafening against the silence. The thing staggered, its movements jerky, unnatural. But it didn't stop. It roared, a horrible deep noise that rattled Caleb's bones. The boat tipped wildly, water sloshing in. "We're gonna flip," Caleb shouted. Mason fired again, then the flashlight slipped from his grasp and vanished into the river. Darkness swallowed them. And then the silence returned. The boat rocked violently, but the thing was gone. Caleb didn't dare breathe. The fog curled around them again, thick and suffocating. Mason's voice was a raw whisper. "Did we kill it?" A deep, distant splash, not retreating, circling. Caleb's stomach dropped. "No," he said. "It's still out there." Neither of them spoke as they paddled back to shore. But before they reached land, the fog shifted again, just for a moment, revealing the thing standing on the bank watching them, waiting. And as they pulled away, they heard it breathe, deep, heavy, hungry. The river was too still that night. Cody stood at the end of the old dock, watching the surface of the Monongahela stretch into the darkness. The moon hung low, casting a faint silver sheen over the water. A cool wind rattled the reeds along the bank, but the river itself was silent. Too silent. Behind him, Jake rummaged through their tackle box. "You sure this is the right spot?" Cody nodded. "Locals say this is where it happened, right by the bend." Jake snorted. "You mean where that old fisherman swore some river monster took his boat?" Cody gave him a sideways glance. "You got a better idea?" Jake shook his head and cast his line into the water. "I think we just wasted a good Friday night." Cody didn't answer. Something felt wrong. The Monongahela wasn't a peaceful river. It was full of life, always moving, always whispering. But tonight, it was waiting. Then the first ripple appeared. Cody stiffened. The water, flat as glass moments ago, shuddered. Just a little. Just enough to notice. Jake reeled in slightly. "Did you see?" The dock groaned beneath them. A deep, heavy thud vibrated through the wood, shaking their feet. Jake whipped around. "What was that?" Cody's pulse kicked up. Something hit the dock. Jake scoffed, but it was forced. Probably a log. But Cody knew better, because logs didn't breathe. From the darkness beyond the dock, a deep, rumbling exhale bubbled up from beneath the water. A sound that was too large, too deliberate. Jake yanked his line back, his hands shaking. "We should go." Before Cody could answer, the river exploded. A massive shape surged from the depths, sending water crashing over the dock. Cody barely had time to stumble back before he saw it. The shell came first, thick, jagged, ancient, like something carved from stone and buried for centuries. Then the tail, long and muscular, whipping through the water with a force that sent waves rolling to shore. And then the head, if you could call it that, a gaping beaked maw snapping open and shut, strong enough to crush bone. Eyes black and depthless, locked onto them. Jake screamed and bolted toward the shore. Cody couldn't move. The Ogua rose higher, its massive body pushing through the water like a nightmare made real. Then it charged. The dock shattered as the beast surged forward, its bulk slamming into the wooden planks, sending splinters flying. Cody ran. His boots pounded against the shaking boards as water sprayed up around him. Jake had already made it to shore, shouting his name. The Ogua let out a low, guttural bellow, the sound vibrating in Cody's ribs. Then a crack. The dock gave way. Cody fell. Cold water swallowed him, the river closing over his head. Beneath the surface, he saw it. the shadow moving toward him faster than anything that size should move. The tail whipped. Cody barely dodged as it tore through the water, missing him by inches. He kicked hard, fighting toward the surface, his lungs burning. Then, a hand grabbed his collar and yanked him up. Jake. They stumbled onto the shore, gasping, soaked. For a moment, nothing but silence. Then a ripple. The Ogua sank back into the depths, disappearing as if it had never been there. Cody and Jake sat there, shivering, watching the water. The river was still again. Too still. And they knew it was still down there, waiting. The factory had been dead for decades. It loomed at the edge of the valley, a rusting skeleton of industry, forgotten and left to rot in the damp West Virginia air. Once it had churned out steel beams and machinery parts, but now only silence remained, except for the things that moved inside it after dark. Ethan didn't believe in the stories. "You really want to go up there?" Joel asked, shifting uneasily as they stood at the overgrown entrance. His flashlight cast a weak, flickering beam over the rusted-out gate. "Place is condemned," Ethan said, smirking. "Nobody's been inside for years. Perfect spot to check out." Joel exhaled sharply. "Yeah, 'cause there's a reason for that." "Right, 'cause of the Mothman." Ethan chuckled. "Come on, man. You're really buying into that old legend." Joel didn't laugh. "The mining accidents, the factory collapse, the bridge disaster," he muttered. "People always see something before bad stuff happens. Red eyes in the dark." Ethan shook his head and stepped through the broken gate. The air changed the second they crossed the threshold. The night felt heavier, like the sky was pressing down on them. The wind, which had been still moments before, sighed through the skeletal remains of the building, whispering through broken windows and corroded beams. Inside, the factory was worse. Rusted machinery jutted out of the floor like fossilized bones. The smell of old oil and mildew clung to the air, thick and sour. Their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, swallowed by shadows stretching into corners where their flashlights couldn't reach. Something moved. Joel froze. "You hear that?" A soft scraping high above them. Ethan shined his light upward. The rusted catwalks creaked under the weight of decades, their chains swaying ever so slightly. There was nothing there. Yet. "Wind," Ethan muttered, pressing forward. Joel hesitated, then followed. The deeper they went, the more wrong it felt. The silence wasn't natural. It wasn't the quiet of abandonment. It was held, waiting, as if the factory itself were holding its breath. Then came the first sign, a clicking sound, soft, rhythmic, like metal tapping against metal. Ethan whipped his flashlight toward the source. Nothing, just rusted machinery and gaping shadows. Then a flutter. Not the flapping of a bird, something bigger, heavier. Joel grabbed his arm. "We need to leave." "Relax, man." Ethan rolled his eyes, stepping forward. And the eyes opened. Two massive burning red orbs blinked in the darkness above. A shape unfolded from the rafters, shifting as if made of the shadows themselves. The Mothman, if that's what it was huge, its wingspan stretching nearly the width of the room. It dropped. Ethan screamed, stumbling back as the thing landed on the rusted machinery with a metal shrieking clang. The air trembled as its wings snapped open, dust and debris swirling in the sudden gust. The clicking sound returned, only now it was closer. Ethan scrambled backward, his flashlight shaking wildly as he tried to focus on its shape. The creature wasn't entirely solid. It seemed to shift between forms, its wings dissolving into the dark before reforming again. And then it spoke, not in words, not exactly. A low, warbling hum filled the space, vibrating in their bones. It wasn't human, wasn't animal, just wrong. Joel didn't hesitate. He ran. Ethan was a second behind him, tripping over rusted debris as he sprinted toward the exit. Behind them, the factory trembled. Metal beams groaned, windows shattered, dust rained from above. The thing wasn't chasing them, but something else was happening. Ethan looked back once, just once, before they broke through the doorway. The creature stood in the center of the factory, its eyes locked on him, and the walls shifted. The ground shuddered. The ceiling creaked as if it were about to collapse. The factory was falling apart. Joel yanked him forward, and they burst outside just as the first beams came crashing down in a shriek of tearing metal and breaking stone. They didn't stop running until they reached the road, panting, shaking. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Joel, voice raw, muttered, "I told you." Ethan swallowed, still staring back at the dust cloud rising from the ruins of the factory. The legends had been right. People always saw something before disaster struck. And now the factory was gone. But the Mothman, it was still out there, watching, waiting for the next disaster. The wind carried a sound through the empty streets of Black Hollow, a sound that didn't belong. Jason paused, gripping his flashlight tighter. The beam barely cut through the thick swirling mist that hugged the crumbling remains of the town. Storefronts with shattered windows leaned at odd angles, and rusted coal carts sat frozen in time, waiting for miners who would never return. A deep screech echoed from the ridge above. "Tell me you heard that," Mason whispered. Jason swallowed hard. He'd grown up on stories of Black Hollow, the cursed town, the one abandoned after the mine collapsed in the 1950s. People left, but something stayed. "Probably an owl," Jason said, though he didn't believe it. They had come here as a dare, a last thrill before Mason moved out of state. People said Black Hollow was haunted, but Jason never put much stock in ghosts. Something worse lived here. A shadow moved across the rooftops. Fast. Silent. Mason swore under his breath, swinging his flashlight up. Nothing. Then the smell hit them. A mix of damp earth, rotting wood, and something foul like old blood. Jason turned toward the boarded-up church at the end of the street. Its steeple, crooked from decades of neglect, pointed into the sky like a broken finger. Another screech, closer this time. Mason grabbed his arm. "We need to go." Jason nodded, his heart pounding. The wind shifted, rattling the old minecart tracks. And then, a gust of air, powerful and unnatural. Jason barely had time to register the massive shadow descending from above before Mason screamed and was yanked off his feet. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam spinning wildly as Jason turned in horror. Mason was gone. Something huge loomed above the rooftops, its wings stretched wide against the moonlit fog. It wasn't a bird, wasn't a bat. It was something wrong. Its long, scaly body twisted in the air, catching the light in flashes of sickly green and gray. Talons, hooked razor-sharp, curled inward as it lifted its tentacled maw toward the sky. Jason saw Mason struggling, tangled in writhing, slimy appendages that coiled around his limbs. And then, with another ear-splitting shriek, the Snallygaster took off. Jason ran. His boots pounded against the cracked pavement as he sprinted after it, his mind screaming, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it was. He saw Mason thrashing, twisting, fighting for his life, dangling helplessly as the creature soared toward the old mine entrance. Jason didn't hesitate. He ran straight for the mouth of the mine, where a rotting wooden sign still read, "Danger, collapsed tunnels." Inside, the air was thick and wrong, filled with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient. A rusted lantern sat on the ground. Jason snatched it up, fumbling for his lighter. Mason's muffled yell echoed from somewhere deep inside. Jason's heart pounded as he crept forward. He could hear something moving, slithering, scraping against the rock. Then the breathing. Deep, wet, unnatural. Jason's hands trembled as he lifted the lantern, revealing the nest. Tangled bones, stripped clean skulls. The remains of deer, cows, and something human-sized. And above it all, the Snallygaster. It was perched on a ledge, wings half folded, its grotesque beak clicking as it studied Mason. The tentacles around his body tightened. Jason's chest burned with fear, but he only had one chance. He lifted the lantern high and threw it. Glass shattered. Oil ignited. Flames exploded across the nest. The Snallygaster shrieked, wings snapping open as fire licked at the damp, rotting wood. Mason hit the ground hard. "Move!" Jason grabbed him, pulling him toward the entrance. The Snallygaster screeched in fury, its tentacles lashing at the burning cavern, its wings stirring up embers like fireflies in the dark. Jason and Mason ran. The mine shuddered. The old supports groaned. And behind them, with one last terrible roar, the ceiling collapsed. The fire died beneath the tons of rock, trapping the beast inside. They didn't stop running until they reached the truck. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Mason, shaking breathless, managed, "You believe now?" Jason exhaled, and in the distance, from deep beneath the collapsed mine, a muffled screech answered.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Got an idea or a story you'd like to hear? Drop it in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and keep the lights on.